So the first question that we have is, in terms of sequencing platforms, how do you deal with labs using different sequencing platforms or different pipelines or software for variant calling? And then as a follow-up, is it a good reason for disagreement?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I do want to come back to say that the main purpose of Clinvar is really to share our knowledge of variants. So in some ways, we're less concerned about the specific pipeline or how that variant was generated, because we're really talking about what's your interpretation or classification of the variant. Now, that said, we base our classifications on observations from laboratory sequencing. And so it is important that the underlying data be valid. And I can tell you that, one of the reasons that we work heavily with clinical labs is that those observations that they identify are largely well validated. Either they have been orthogonally confirmed with Sanger sequencing in this current era of mostly next-gen sequencing, or those next-gen pipelines have been well validated to ensure that when they report out a variant, it is real and validated, despite, regardless of what the platforms were. Occasionally, that data may be a false call, and it's important when you look at the evidence to read the papers, understand their methods that they use to count the number of cases. And occasionally we have some concerns because there's a particular variant in a particular gene in a homologous region, and we might have concerns that lots of the data, whether it's from the Clinvar submitters or the publications out there, may not have correctly identified the variant because it could have come from a homologous region. So those are things to think about, but I can tell you that the vast majority of data upon which we work, in Clinvar and our own laboratories is well validated data and is accurate variant calls. So it's rarely a reason for disagreement, but it can happen.
Our next question is, I fully agree with the need to submit variants to Clinvar, particularly for those of us interpreting variants in African samples. You mentioned that the main contributors to Clinvar are commercial labs. In your view, should those of us who perform whole genome sequencing in a research setting have concerns about submitting to Clinvar prior to publication of our research findings? Related to this, the ClinGen VCI would seem to be a very useful tool to classify variants during the course of a research project, but my understanding is that these classifications are automatically ingested into Clinvar. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's a few really critical points in this question. So one, it's actually not the majority of submitters that are clinical labs, the majority of content. And in fact, as Melissa will talk about, there's, over 1,700 submitters to Clinvar, and many of those are from research groups, often smaller submissions, but nonetheless, we have Clinvar has lots of submitters that are from research groups. And it's really critically important that that research data be submitted. And in fact, a lot of the detailed case level data often comes from researchers where they have consent and they've well studied these families. So it is really important that research submissions go into Clinvar. Melissa can probably address this better, but there's an option when you are submitting to Clinvar to have your data not go live and be held for 6 months. That allows for the time for publication. And if you use the variant curation interface that ClinGen supports, the data does not go into Clinvar until you hit approve and ask for it to go in. And I should even mention right now that's not automated. It actually then requires some behind the scenes people. Stephen Harrison, who's speaking next, does a bunch of these submissions for our expert panels, for example. So it's not an automatic, just because you use the VCI does not mean your data goes automatically into Clinvar. You control that. So that said, I do encourage people, even though you can hold it and not let it go live, it's important to share your data as soon as you have it. It helps the community classify variants more quickly. So, and it won't stop you from publishing your paper. You can still publish your paper because there's many important findings in your paper that aren't just the variant classification. So you have that control, but I do encourage everyone to think about putting your preprint on bioRxiv or medRxiv and immediately submitting those variants to Clinvar and allowing them to be shown, but it's in your control.
Our next question is, I wanted to know, while you're testing the sharing variant database with labs, especially clinical labs, did you have issues regarding competitions between them?
So I would say for the vast majority of laboratories out there, they are ready and willing to share their variant classifications and do not feel that their business strategy is negatively impacted by sharing. They view it as important to ensure that knowledge sharing helps contribute to accurate classification of variants. And they view that, often view that their sharing with Clinvar is a gold star for their laboratory and helps them get business. There are, right now I could identify maybe 2 laboratories that I think feel that their knowledge base is their competitive edge, and they have not been willing to share. But I can tell you it's a very small number that are not sharing because of what they perceive as competitive reasons. Most of the reason that labs are still not yet sharing is really around resources. It does require resources and commitment to send your data to Clinvar and get it in a format and do all of the work. And so most of the reason that some labs haven't gotten there yet is just around the logistics, the resources. Very few consider this to be a competitive thing.
Our next question is, how should we deal with changes between Clinvar versions when reporting pathogenicity in our research?
So one thing to keep in mind is that Clinvar is not making claims of pathogenicity itself. Clinvar, as Melissa would tell you, brings submissions together, compares them, and will give you a calculated overall classification that might say conflicting because the individual submitters disagree with each other. So what you really should think about is not what's the version of Clinvar and what does Clinvar say. You should think about what is the entire world's knowledge base that I have access to talking about this variant. And so when you go in to classify a variant, so a lot of us, what we do is we download Clinvar data and we put it into our pipelines so that we can flag, like if we're doing exome or genome sequencing, we flag variants to pay particular attention to because someone who's submitted to Clinvar has called it pathogenic. We want to make sure we look at those variants. Maybe they're causative in my patient. So we're ingesting that data as frequently as we can manage. And the recommendations are at a minimum every 6 months that you should ingest new versions that are coming out from professional guidance, but as frequently as you can do it is best because Clinvar is updated, I think, weekly. Melissa will clarify. But when we actually go to write a clinical report on one of those variants that might have been flagged in our pipeline, we go back into Clinvar and we look at everyone's submission and all of the evidence that's in there pointing to PubMed IDs and those publications, and we reevaluate. We even reevaluate if a ClinGen expert panel has submitted, because that was done at a point in time and a new paper could have come out since then. So when we actually write a clinical report, it is based on the current real-time data that we have access to in the published literature and that's been submitted to Clinvar. And so I don't think about it as a versioning of which database, although that is true in your pipelines, but it is right now today when I sign out that report as a clinical lab director, it is based on everything I could get my hands on. Hopefully that answers it.
The next question is, variants are coming from everywhere. Are they directly included in the Clinvar database if they provide good evidence, or is there a committee of checking that checks before approving?
So Melissa will talk about what the Clinvar team does. They do a lot of work to ensure, that variants are correctly mapped to the genome and, the fields are mapped appropriately. So that's done, as the Clinvar team, but the Clinvar team does not have the capacity, frankly, no one in the world has the capacity to review, 1.3 million submissions to any database, and that's what's already in Clinvar. So they're not checking to say, well, this submitter said it was pathogenic. Do we agree with them? That can't happen at that scale. So they're automated methods. Melissa will talk about the QC that they do on their part, but it is up to you as a user of Clinvar and as well as a user of the public literature in PubMed to review the evidence and understand guidelines that Stephen will talk about for how you evaluate evidence and draw your own conclusion in terms of the classification of that variant that you may then write in your paper or provide to your patient, et cetera.
How often would you recommend reevaluation of variants, assuming the research lab has some capacity or resources to do so?
That's also a good question, and it has been a topic that has been discussed among professional organizations. So if you have a clinical lab and you're classifying variants on an ongoing basis, do you have to re-look at all of the evidence every time you see that variant? And what most labs have is some policy that says, if we've done the full reevaluation within X months, we can just let that current evaluation go out. And I would say most labs have a policy that ranges between 3 to 6 months. It does vary by classification. So some labs will be, if it's reached pathogenic, we will only relook at it every 6 months. But if it's likely pathogenic, we'll look at it every 3 months. And if it's uncertain, we will look at it every time we sign it out until it changes category. If it's likely benign, we will only look at it once a year or every time Nomad releases a new data set, because most of those variants are classified often based on aggregate allele frequencies in the population. So each of the classification categories will influence how often a laboratory may choose to reassess that variant. But I would say on average, it's between 0 and 6 months, unless it's like a variant that's never going to change, like Delta 508 for cystic fibrosis and so on.
Okay, we have a technical question. In case the identified variant is not present in Clinvar, which in silico tool do you recommend for evaluating its predicted impact?
So I'm going to mostly punt that to Stephen Harrison. He probably will touch a little bit on that aspect of variant classification, but just a quick short answer. There are lots of tools out there. None of them are perfect. Probably at best, they hit an 85% accuracy. So you can never rely solely on them. It's just one piece of evidence. Probably some of the meta predictors that bring multiple methods and algorithms and approaches into a single overarching meta predictors. They're probably better. Things like Revel are commonly used in the ClinGen expert panels, but these algorithms keep coming out. And so, trying to keep up with them and what works better. And there is differences between genes. Some of these algorithms work better for one gene than another gene, and they get validated by each of our expert panels. So I don't have a perfect answer. Stephen may touch on that a little bit, and because we do have a group within the sequence variant interpretation work group that's trying to give better guidance in this area.
And then one last question. Does ClinGen work directly with patients to return updated variant information?
It's a great question. So ClinGen does have a patient registry called Genome Connect, and patients are free to, and we encourage and we reach out to submit their own clinical reports to ClinGen. They also will fill out surveys of their phenotypic data, and they can consent to sharing that information with the broader community. ClinGen then submits their variants that are classified from their reports into Clinvar. And as we worked on trying to support that process, we would discover that their variants, since their report had been reclassified by the laboratory that issued their report, and they didn't know that. And so through that process, we have been communicating alerts to patients that submitted their reports to tell them that knowledge has changed and they should reach out to their physician. So that has been a mechanism that ClinGen does directly engage with patients and allow them to benefit from knowledge that changes over time.
So a final question has just come in. Heidi, I'm going to ask if you will type an answer to that, and we will go ahead and get started with Stephen Harrison.
Great. Take care.